They called my cabin an eyesore, said it clashed with their lakefront lifestyle, sent letters, fines, even took photos from across the water like they were building a case. Then they claimed it was an unauthorized structure, a hazard, and tried to get it condemned. I built nothing. I inherited everything. That cabin stood longer than any of their luxury homes. It weathered storms, hosted 4 generations of my family, and watched this lake turn from quiet sanctuary to HOA playground. They didn't ask. They didn't knock. They just filed a demolition order behind closed doors and sent a crew to level it. But they made one mistake. They assumed I was just some stubborn holdout with no say, some relic standing in the way of their lakeside empire. So I walked into their emergency meeting. Not to argue, not to beg. I laid down one document, then another, land deeds, titles, lease agreements. And then I said it. You didn't just try to evict a resident. You tried to bulldoze the man who owns the land under your HOA. The room went still, because in their rush to control the lake, they forgot who actually owned the shore, that if an HOA can target someone just for standing in the way of lakefront profits, what happens when the person they target actually owns the land under their feet? They call my home a nuisance. They called my grandfather's cabin non-compliant. They call me uncooperative, outdated, even defiant. All because I wouldn't cave to their vision of lakeside uniformity. But what they never called me was what I actually am, the landlord. While they were passing out violations and drawing up demolition plans, I was holding the title to the ground they were building on. While they painted me as some backward loner holding up progress, I was collecting lease payments through a shell company they never thought to trace. They thought I was a squatter. Turns out, they were paying me rent. So the moment they came for my home, the moment they crossed that final line, they triggered something much bigger than a zoning dispute. They turned a quiet landowner into their biggest problem. And by the time I walked into that meeting with the deeds and lease terms in hand, the board didn't just owe me an apology. They owed me back pay. The cabin sat exactly where my grandfather built it in 1961, 12 feet from the tree line, 32 steps from the water, and precisely 0 inches outside the boundaries of the land he'd left me. It wasn't flashy, just cedar, stone, and weathered shingles. No Wi-Fi, no central air, just the creak of the dock at night, the call of loons at dawn, and the soft hum of generations who came here not to impress, but to breathe. It was my home, not full-time. I still had a place in the city where I worked most of the week. But every weekend, every summer, every winter retreat, I came back to that cabin like clockwork. My grandfather called it the last honest place. And for a long time it was, until Hillridge Lakeside HOA showed up. When the developers arrived a decade ago, they came with smiles, town hall renderings, and the promise of environmentally conscious luxury lakefront homes. They bought up every parcel around the lake except mine. The cabin lot was never for sale, not even in passing. My grandfather made sure of that. So they built around it, wrapped a road behind it, installed smart street lamps, and named their new community Hillridge Shores. At first, it was civil, polite nods, occasional newsletters I ignored. I paid no HOA dues and made it clear I never would. Their contracts didn't apply to my land. But then came the notices. It started with a letter. Dear property occupant, as part of our commitment to maintaining aesthetic consistency, we've identified several non-conforming structures impacting lakefront presentation. Your cabin's exterior does not align with current standards. I chuckled, tossed it. 2 weeks later, another. Warning, your dwelling appears in violation of HOA Uniformity Code 3.1.2. Non-standard siding and visible rooftop chimneys facing public lakefront. Public lakefront? That lake had been part of our family's legacy since long before uniformity was a word people thought to weaponize. Then came the fines. $150 for non-compliant visual disruption. $200 for unauthorized signage, referring to the hand-carved cabin of stillness plaque my grandfather made in 1973. $300 for refusal to cooperate with Community Lakefront Design Initiative. Each notice arrived with the same tone, faux-friendly, dripping in corporate pleasantries that barely masked the threat. I responded with exactly one email. Please provide legal basis for enforcement actions against a property outside HOA jurisdiction. I expect full documentation. I never got an answer. Instead, they went louder. Karen, of course it was a Karen, began including my cabin in group emails to the entire HOA, calling it a safety concern, a blight on the lake, and an unfortunate reminder of what happens when properties fall through regulatory cracks. Neighbors began looking at me differently, not with curiosity, but with caution, as if my place, my history, my very presence was somehow unclean, less than. And then, without warning, it escalated. It was a Saturday morning. I had just stepped out onto the porch with a cup of black coffee and a book when I heard the sound. Not birds, not wind, engines. I walked down the path barefoot, still in my flannel shirt, and turned the corner just in time to see a flatbed truck backing down the access road. Behind it, a bulldozer. There were 3 men in hard hats. One held a clipboard. Another pointed at the cabin like he was marking a tree to be felled. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice louder than normal. The clipboard guy turned, squinting. "You the owner?" "Yes. We're here for structural removal. You've been served." I stared. "Served by whom?" "HOA board. Said this structure was condemned under emergency visual code enforcement. So it was abandoned and unsafe. We've got demo orders signed." "No, you don't," I said flatly. "Look, man, we're just the crew. Don't get in the way, all right?" I stepped between them and the cabin. "You'll have to go through me." One of the men laughed. "Suit yourself." I pulled out my phone, took a picture of their plates, then one of their faces. Then I dialed the sheriff's non-emergency number. "Hey, it's Mason Ward, parcel 17A, Hill Ridge Lake. There's a crew on my land claiming they have orders to demolish my home. I need a unit out here. Now." It took 22 minutes. In that time, the crew argued, stalled, and one even made a show of revving the bulldozer like he wanted me to move. I didn't. When the deputy arrived, I handed him a copy of my deed, always kept in a lockbox under the porch, and told him exactly what happened. The officer asked to see the work order. The crew handed it over. One glance was all it took. "Sir," the deputy said, turning to the foreman, "this order applies to HOA-managed common areas. This property is not under HOA jurisdiction. You're trespassing." They left in silence. No apology. Just reversed the truck, packed up the bulldozer, and peeled out. But the damage wasn't physical. It was psychological. They were willing to bulldoze my history because it didn't fit their brochure. They tried to erase my family's footprint because it didn't align with their bottom line. And they thought I was powerless to stop them. They thought I was just a man in a wooden box clinging to the past. But what they didn't know, what they never even bothered to ask, was whose name was listed on the land beneath half their homes. Because while they were busy drawing lines on a map, I was holding the title to the whole lakefront lease. And now it was my turn to make some noise. After the bulldozer incident, something inside me shifted. I had spent months playing defense, swatting away fines, ignoring HOA spam, resisting their endless pressure to disappear. But now, they had crossed the line. Not metaphorically, literally. They tried to destroy my cabin, without notice, without authority, and without understanding who they were messing with. So I did what they never expected. I stopped reacting and started investigating. It began with the deed. I drove 2 counties over to the archive office where the original paper records were still kept on microfilm. I wanted everything, not just my property line, but the lake boundaries, the pre-HOA zoning maps, and the transitional files from when Hill Ridge Shores was first approved as a residential development. What I found changed everything. The lake wasn't fully HOA property. In fact, almost none of it was. The entire northern shoreline, where all the luxury homes were built, was part of a long-term land lease agreement issued nearly 20 years ago by a private holding company. The houses were real, but the land beneath them wasn't owned by the residents. It was rented. The lease covered roads, green spaces, and the prize shared lakefront. The only titled properties along the southern curve? 2. Mine and an abandoned boathouse parcel, still listed under the original pre-development owner. The HOA, it turned out, didn't have ownership of the lake. They had permission to use it, as long as the lease remained active. My pulse kicked up. I requested a certified copy of the lease document. There, buried on page 3, was a signature line next to a corporate name I hadn't heard in years. Ward Legacy Trust Holdings. My grandfather's name sat beneath it in fading blue ink. My name had replaced it 3 years ago, automatically, when I updated our family estate paperwork. My jaw clenched. They were leasing the lake from me, without even realizing it. I raced home and pulled every HOA communication I'd ever received. Fines, letters, newsletters, community maps. One pamphlet showed planned dock expansions, full-color mock-ups of high-end boat slips and luxury dock memberships they planned to sell for tens of thousands of dollars. They were building a lakefront business on leased land they didn't even fully control. And my cabin? It was the one thing they couldn't package. They needed it gone. Not for safety, not for visual harmony, but for profit. It sat too close to their future plans, too close to the truth. If the public knew that the HOA homes weren't even fully owned, that the ground beneath their lakefront paradise was borrowed, it would shatter their narrative, their prestige, their resale value. And as I started digging deeper, the web grew darker. I searched the county business registry for the holding firm listed as the landowner on their lease agreement. It was a single-member LLC based in the state capital. No office, no staff, just a mailbox and a legal filing agent. But the listed manager? Me. I had forgotten all about it. My grandfather set it up with his attorney decades ago as a shield layer, standard practice for asset protection. The LLC owned the land. I owned the LLC, quietly, cleanly, legally. So not only was I the owner of the only fully titled lakefront cabin, I was also the landlord of the HOA itself. They had paid me lease fees for the last 3 years, automated withdrawals from their HOA maintenance budget, deposited into the holding account I had marked Do Not Touch in my trust portfolio. I sat back, stunned. They tried to find me, evict me, demolish me, but they were the tenants. They'd spent all their energy trying to prove I didn't belong, not realizing I literally owned the land under their clubhouse, their prized lake docks, and a walking path they called a community asset. I stared at the last email they'd sent, a threatening final notice demanding I remove my non-compliant structure or face civil escalation. I didn't delete it. I printed it, and I stapled it to a copy of their own lease agreement, the one with my name as the landlord, just to show how poetic this was about to get. They wanted a war. I wasn't just bringing paperwork. I was bringing the ground they stood on. Let me know when you're ready for part 5. The counterattack begins, where the protagonist prepares the perfect strategic strike, legal notices in hand, and sets the stage for the most satisfying public reveal yet. You said, 5. Third topic. The counterattack begins, 2,000 words. Style, strategic and suspenseful. Scene. Protagonist works with his attorney to compile property records, tax rolls, and lease documents. Sends cease and desist to HOA threatening legal action for harassment and trespassing. Posts public notice on cabin door. This land is not HOA jurisdiction, private title. Quietly prepares the final strike. A legal notice demanding rent adjustments and lease renegotiations. Plans to present it at the upcoming emergency HOA board meeting. ChatGPT said, "Here is part 5. The counterattack begins, written in a strategic and suspenseful tone with immersive pacing and legal intensity to match 2,000 words of story impact." I did not show up at their door with a hammer or a headline. I showed up with a lawyer. Her name was Grace Eldridge, a straight-talking real estate litigator who once took down a developer for building a golf course on protected wetlands. When I laid out the documents, my title, the LLC structure, the lease history, she didn't blink. "They've been trespassing," she said. "And if they sent anyone else to that cabin, that's harassment, plain and simple. We got to work." She requested tax rolls, easement records, and HOA bylaws. I compiled digital timestamps from my family trust, tracing every transfer and signature back to the original lake survey. Together, we drafted a cease and desist letter that read like a thunderclap, short, sharp, and final. To the Hillridge Shores Homeowners Association. Effective immediately, cease all communications, enforcement actions, or attempts to alter, access, or assess Parcel 17A. This parcel falls outside HOA jurisdiction and is held in private title by Ward Legacy Trust Holdings. Any further intrusion will be treated as criminal trespass and subject to civil penalties. Copies were sent via certified mail, email, and one printed hard copy posted right on the cabin's front door, under a new hand-painted sign that read, "This land is not HOA jurisdiction, private title. Trespassers will be prosecuted." I didn't add barbed wire. I didn't install cameras. Just a notice, plain and bold. Let the message hang in the lake air like smoke from a long dormant fire. The next day, I got a call. Not from Karen. She wouldn't risk speaking to me directly now, but from Greg, the treasurer. He opened with a cough, then a nervous chuckle. "Hey there, Mason. Just touching base on some confusion, I guess. Some lines seem a little blurry on the property filings, and the board, well, we didn't exactly realize." I cut him off gently. "Greg, you're leasing the lake from me. It's not blurry. It's contractual." Dead silence. Then he mumbled something about scheduling an emergency meeting to discuss land use clarity. I agreed. "You might want to bring your legal counsel. I'll be bringing mine." That night, I stayed up drafting the final blow. A lease renegotiation packet. Inside, a demand for rent adjustment retroactive to the date of their first fine against me. An addendum requiring ethical conduct clauses for all HOA leadership, including non-harassment terms and zero-tolerance enforcement policy abuse. And my favorite page, an updated map of the lakefront color-coded, showing that all their prized shared-use zones were leased, not owned, and subject to immediate restriction if terms were violated again. I printed it on thick, cream-colored paper, bound it in a clean black folder, titled the cover, "Ward Legacy Holdings, Lease Update Proposal Hillridge Shores HOA." And then I waited. The board sent out the notice that same day. Emergency HOA meeting, urgent land jurisdiction discussion. Attendance mandatory for all board members. Karen's name was on the header, still clutching the title of president, still pretending this wasn't slipping from her hands like lake water through a cracked dock. I prepared for the moment quietly, pressed my clothes, polished my boots, packed my folder, and brought the truth with me like a loaded weapon, legal, precise, and ready to fire. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 6 p.m., but the lot was already full by 5:30. Word had spread, not just about the lake or the cabin or the fines, but about something deeper, something structural. The board had labeled the session unauthorized structure interference and jurisdictional review. Vague, corporate, and utterly incapable of capturing what was about to unfold. I parked down the hill and walked in with my briefcase in one hand and the truth in the other. Inside, the room buzzed with low murmurs. Residents fanned themselves with printouts, squinting at half-understood maps they had pulled from the online portal. A few familiar faces nodded at me, not warmly, but with quiet curiosity. A few others looked nervous. At the front of the room, the board sat at a long table, Karen in the center, flanked by Greg and the others. They wore the expressions of people pretending to be calm while the floor shifted beneath them. I didn't wait to be called. I stepped to the center microphone, clicked open my briefcase, laid one folder on the lectern, then looked up. "Before you discuss demolishing my cabin," I said, voice level and clear, "you may want to check your landlord's name." The room stilled. One of the newer board members blinked, unsure if he'd heard me right. I opened the folder, pulled out the first page, a certified deed of trust. Then another, a lease agreement with the Hillridge Shores HOA as tenant. Then another, a business license for Ward Legacy Trust Holdings LLC. "Your HOA," I continued, "has been leasing the majority of its lakefront land, including your docks, your walking path, and the eastern slope where you built your clubhouse, from a holding firm created by my grandfather. That firm is now managed by me." I paused, and I can assure you, it is in very good standing. Karen tried to speak, but her voice caught. Greg leaned forward, mouth parted in disbelief. One of the residents, Teresa, from Lot 12, leaned into the aisle to get a better look. Someone in the back muttered, "Wait, what?" I held up the lease document, flipping to the signature line. This, I said, is your legal agreement to operate on land you do not own. It grants you the right to maintain shared spaces only under conditions of ethical conduct, non-interference, and full compliance with state code. Which means I laid down the cease and desist letter next. Your fines against me? Invalid. Your demolition attempt? Illegal. Your communications implying jurisdiction over parcel 17A? False. Another silence. I leaned forward just slightly. And under the new lease review terms I prepared, I continued. Your access to those lakefront amenities will now be subject to annual review. That includes ethical compliance evaluations for board members and disciplinary clauses for overreach or harassment of non-member landholders. I heard someone exhale, long and slow. Karen stood now, eyes wide but voice low. You can't just rewrite terms. I haven't rewritten anything, I said, flipping the final page. I'm invoking my rights under Clause 10, Section C of the original agreement. You know, the clause that allows the landowner to initiate review in the case of aggressive or unlawful behavior toward non-HOA landholders or properties. She froze. She didn't know that clause existed. Most of them didn't, because most of them had never read what they signed. They thought the HOA gave them power, but the ground beneath their feet told a different story. I turned to face the room now, not just the board, but the residents. Let me be clear. I'm not asking for control. I've had it this whole time. I've chosen not to use it. Until now. But if this board continues down the road it's on, if it continues targeting people like me who don't fit a marketing brochure, then that lease is over. Karen's mouth opened, then shut. A hand from the board's end went up. Linda, one of the quieter members. I'd like to motion for the board to enter immediate review of our leadership structure, she said, voice steady but sharp, including the resignation of our current president. Karen's face drained. Greg looked at her, then at me. Then he slowly raised his hand and said, seconded. A beat passed. Then hands started going up. Residents. Members. Even two of the board's longest-serving members. Karen's voice cracked. You're siding with him? After everything we've built? Someone from the crowd, an older man in a fishing vest, stood up. No, Karen, he said. You built it on borrowed land. He's just reminding us who lent it. She looked around the room and saw what I saw. The tide had turned. Her power wasn't slipping. It was gone. She didn't slam her binder. She didn't storm out. She just picked up her papers, folded them slowly, and walked out the side door. No applause. Just release. The weight she'd held over this place, over these people, finally lifted. I gathered my papers and returned to my seat. Greg cleared his throat and called the next agenda item, but the meeting never really recovered, because something bigger had just happened. This wasn't about a cabin anymore. It was about truth, and every single person in that room now knew. Control doesn't come from a position. It comes from foundation. Change did not come overnight, but it came. After the meeting, the board formally dissolved its existing leadership structure. A transitional committee was formed, composed of volunteers from across the neighborhood, including some who had once backed Karen without question. This time, there were no secret votes, no hushed hallway decisions. Everything went on the record. Everything was open. The new guidelines were drafted by a mix of legal advisors and residents. Clear, concise, and, most importantly, fair. No more weaponized citations. No more jurisdictional overreach. Non-member properties were explicitly recognized and protected. Ethical governance became not just a suggestion, but a condition of holding office. The HOA shrank in authority, but the community? It grew stronger. One of the first new motions passed was a unanimous vote to formally designate my cabin as a protected historical structure. The motion included full recognition of the Ward family's stewardship of the lake, dating back over half a century. A plaque was installed near the trailhead. The Ward cabin, established 1961, preserved in honor of those who cared for the lake before it was profitable. I didn't ask for that, but when they offered it, I accepted. Not because I needed the recognition, but because my grandfather deserved it. In the months that followed, I began laying the groundwork for something I had once only dreamed of, a public trail system that circled the outer perimeter of the lake. Not a commercial boardwalk. No vendor stalls. No VIP boat slips. Just a simple, shaded path with signs that told stories about native plant life, conservation practices, the history of the land, and the people who once fished from its banks with cane poles and tackle boxes full of hope. I partnered with a local conservation group to design the signage. Schools began booking visits. Kids hiked the trail with notebooks in hand, marveling at turtles, sketching herons, asking me how old the cabin really was. Sometimes I would sit on the porch with a glass of sun tea, watching them pass. And for the first time in a long time, people didn't avoid eye contact when they saw me. They waved. They asked questions. They said, "I'm sorry." One man, Rick from Lot 9, brought over a bottle of wine and stood awkwardly at the steps for a full minute before speaking. "I voted to fine you," he said. "Twice. I didn't know the full story. I just followed along." I nodded. "You weren't the only one." We sat on the dock in silence, letting the water speak instead. I didn't need revenge. I had restoration, and that meant more. The cabin stayed just as it was, creaky floorboards, uneven steps, and all. I added a new roof, replaced a few of the windows, but the soul of the place never changed. Because it didn't need to. It had survived everything the world threw at it: weather, time, and a board that thought they could bulldoze history just because it didn't match their waterfront brochures. But now it stood at the center of something better. A community that had finally remembered where it came from, and who had kept the lake alive long before anyone ever tried to brand it. They tried to erase my past to rewrite their future. But power doesn't come from how loud you are. It comes from knowing where the land ends and who owns the deed beneath it. They saw a cabin and assumed weakness, saw weathered wood and mistook it for irrelevance. They thought legacy was something you could pave over, that history was something you could find out of existence. But what they never understood is this: you can build a house with rules, but you can only build a home with roots. My grandfather didn't leave me a mansion. He left me a compass, something grounded, quiet, and unshakable. And when the noise came, when the board roared and the bulldozers idled at the edge of my past, I didn't raise my voice to meet theirs. I just opened the drawer, pulled out the deed, and let the truth speak. Because real authority doesn't need permission. It just needs patience. And when the moment comes, when the storm finally breaks, it isn't the one with the title in their mouth who wins. It's the one with the title in their hands.